Hey, it's Jordan with Status Coup. Who knew what when? That is the old adage. And I believe as big of a story as our president's pretty clear cognitive decline, which has been evident for 4 years, which I actually reported on and showed you when he was running in 2020, while the rest of the media pretend it was gaffes and a stutter. Uh, I think as big of a story that is, there's an equally big story on all the media that's suddenly now reporting new instances of Biden's cognitive frozen moments. When did they know this? When did they learn this information? And if they had this information before the debate, pretty clear they sat on it. And there's more and more evidence that major media knew about the cognitive vulnerabilities, shall we say, of the current president and helped cover it up, which is a scandal. But unfortunately, they're not going to cover their own cover-up. Brian Stelter, who, if you remember, used to be CNN's Mr. Reliable Source, he was let go, I believe, a year ago, but he still goes on the network and does a bunch of other things. I met him once. Politically, we're very different. Nice guy, though. I think he's politically kind of naive. I think he believes mentally in some West Wing version of West Wing TV show version of American media, that it's somehow sacred and pure, when I could tell you it's not. And essentially the media in America is helping cover up what's really happening, both because most mainstream journalists are very disconnected from reality happening on the ground in places like Flint, East Palestine, Cop City, etc. But most American journalists aren't interested in those kind of stories. They are interested in the horse race. But Brian Stelter apparently thinks it is false that the media knew about this long ago and just sat on it. I tweeted out yesterday, it's becoming clear a lot of journalists had sourcing and ample reporting on Biden's cognitive decline in communications with everyone from his staff to world leaders long ago and just sat on it for fear of losing access. That is as much a part of the story as Biden's decline. Well, Brian, shut that down. False. Provided no further information to tell me why it's false. So I explained to him what I'm about to show you. You think a Wired journalist like Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame suddenly gathered information of 15 to 20 instances of Biden cognitively freezing dating back a year ago within the last 5 days? You think he didn't know about this before the debate? I also pointed out that in an interview with Senator Chris Coons, Jake Tapper said journalists had known about public and private instances of Biden's cognitive issues. So I would love to talk to Brian. I'd even debate him on the issue. How exactly is this false? Do you have insider information that shows that all these outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Axios, that they just suddenly are doing speed reporting and just suddenly have gathered all this information on, in some cases, 15 to 20 instances of Biden's meltdown cognitively? If you didn't see it, this is Carl Bernstein of Watergate fame. Pay attention to what he says, particularly about how reporters had known about this.
According to the people you've been talking to, what are you hearing?
Well, these are people, several of them, who are very close to President Biden, who love him, have supported him, have been among them are some people who have raised a lot of money for him. And they are adamant that what we saw the other night, the Joe Biden we saw, is not a one-off, that there have been 15, 20 occasions in the last year and a half when the president has appeared somewhat as he did in that horror show that we witnessed. And what's so significant is the people that this is coming from, and also how many people around the president are aware of such incidents, including some reporters, incidentally, who have witnessed some of them.
What's significant, his words, is how many people around the president are aware of this, including some reporters, incidentally, who have seen this. But Brian Stelter tells me it's false, that journalists knew about and saw this well before the debate. well, Jordan, they might have seen instances or this and that, but that's not enough to report on it. Well, I would tell you this. You think if they knew or heard, I'm talking about the New York Times, Washington Post, that they knew or heard instances of Bernie Sanders having cognitive freezes, not being able to finish sentences, losing his train of thought and not being able to pick it back up, having to be gingerly walked behind by other world leaders for fear of him possibly falling? Do you think that they would not report that with an army of unnamed sources? Hell, CNN reported that Bernie Sanders told Elizabeth Warren a woman can't become president based on 4 anonymous sources that, if you really look into it, could have only come from Elizabeth Warren's campaign, because there was only 2 people in the room, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, during that conversation. CNN reported that. You think that they would have reported this if it was Bernie Sanders? I think they would. Listen, this is how the media works. Bernstein is obviously a very wired journalist, did great work during Watergate, hasn't done much since. But these aren't things that he just learns in 5 days after the debate. These are things that, Biden White House officials, people around the president, donors, he's talking to all of them constantly. It's called source maintenance. He's not just picking up the phone now to find out all this. I'm sure he was told much of this well before the debate. He's talking about 15 to 20 instances over the last year and a half. And by the way, we've seen his reporting partner, Bob Woodward, be criticized because he had reporting on Trump, major reporting on Trump, particularly in relation to COVID and what Trump knew about COVID and lied to the public about how serious he knew COVID was. He had that information well over a year before he reported it in his book. Woodward, not Bernstein. And Woodward sat on that so that it would come out in his book. We know that New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman sat on serious information about Trump in order to release it in her book. I find it very hard to believe that Bob Woodward, in the matter of 5 days, spoke with enough people to find out 15 to 20 instances of Biden basically freezing, or what Carl Bernstein described it as, almost like a rigor mortis. Bernstein described it as. He knew well before. But Brian Stelter would tell you, no, that's not possible. The media is pure and has a ton of integrity in this country. It would never sit on information indicating that the president cannot function cognitively. And why this is so important, these are the same people screaming at you that democracy is at risk. And I believe there is real threats with Trump. Make no mistake about it. Trump, particularly given what the Supreme Court just did, which in my view knights presidents to be kings or queens, there is a grave threat with Trump being reelected. Well, they're not acting like it. But it wasn't only Carl Bernstein. Let's take a look when Jake Tapper interviewed Senator Chris Coons. Unless you see differently, Jake Tapper was sure implying that plenty of people had seen instances of Biden malfunctioning well before the debate.
With all due respect, it is not honest to say that this is just one night. There have been moments like this that people have seen in front of the cameras and other moments but with cameras not there. Just 2 weeks ago, let me just show this clip. There was another moment like this, not just a senior losing a train of thought, but something else going on. Here he is. It was in an event about immigration. He tries to introduce DHS Secretary Mayorkas, and there's some sort of glitch. I don't know what it is. Let's roll that tape.
Thanks to all the members of Congress and Homeland Security Secretary. I'm not sure I'm going to introduce you all the way. But all kidding aside, Secretary Mayorkas.
I don't know what that was.
That doesn't trouble me at all, Jake.
That doesn't trouble you at all, huh? Jake Tapper right there said that many people have seen in front of the cameras and off cameras. Well, who are these many people he's talking about? he's a journalist. He talks to other journalists. I can't say for certain, but I assume he's talking about journalists have seen many instances in front of the cameras and behind the cameras. Well, if journalists, and again, assumption, but I believe an educated assumption, if journalists were seeing private snafus with Biden, why wasn't there reporting on it? Well, you could say, well, Jordan, it could have been off the record moments, so they couldn't ethically report it. Yes, if they had off the record exchanges with the president, they wouldn't be able to report it, but it's not clear what he's talking about. Could have been moments where they weren't even interviewing the president. They were just around the president and saw sharp cognitive declines or cognitive freezes. In those cases, they have an obligation to report it. But the bottom line is most of these journalists are, it's not even necessarily that they're team blue, although they are liberal leaning. They don't want to be blamed for re-electing Trump. That's why so many of them criticize reporting on the WikiLeaks releases from 2016, because they didn't want to be blamed for electing Trump and hurting Hillary. It is your job as a journalist to put aside whether it's Trump, Biden, whomever. If you are firsthand witnessing evidence that the person with his or her finger on the nuclear codes is potentially not well, you need to report that ethically. It seems to me, contrary to Brian Stelter's spin, plenty of people knew about this, not just Democratic Party operatives, but journalists. And how could they not? They're around the White House all the time. A lot of them travel with the president. Sure, Biden has been kept under lock and key and shielded from a lot of politicians and journalists, but clearly they had experiences where they were around the president. It's not just Bernstein. It's not just Tapper. Take a look at this New York Times story that just came out. Again, kind of hard to believe that they just got this information. Very hard to believe that they just got this information. Let's take a look at this New York Times reporter who was on CNN talking about their story from yesterday that was titled, "Biden's Lapses Are Said to Be Increasingly Common and Worrisome."
Zolan, good morning to you. This headline is Biden's lapses are said to be increasingly common and worrisome. Several current and former officials and others who encountered him behind closed doors noticed he has increasingly appeared confused or listless or would lose the thread of conversations. This does seem to be part of, certainly Democrats I'm talking to are angry that this is not something that people were willing to acknowledge to them until now. What else have you learned and what are you reporting here?
Sure, and thanks for having me on. You opened by describing the debate performance, and I think for many of us who cover the White House, and really for Americans and voters across the country, the question became how much of this is unique, a one-off, or has something like this been happening more frequently? And while we don't know if it's to the extent of what we saw on the debate stage, our reporting does show that these sort of lapses, these moments where the president can appear listless or confused, that is happening more frequently, according to those that see him behind closed doors, both advisors domestically, but also we wanted to know for the officials that are working with President Biden, are they noticing this? So look, he is blaming this on the circus of travel that he had. We could start there. We could go to the trip in Europe where we talked to European officials who said that they were struck by sort of the decline, particularly physically, by the president. At one point, we also reported that the Italian leader, Giorgia Meloni, as well as other European leaders, when entering a space with the president, would sort of slow down in case he needed time to crowd around him. We talked to a U.S. official, a former U.S. official, who said that the President Biden now, compared to the person that they were working for, that they are not sure if that they would put him in a room with a foreign adversary like Vladimir Putin. We talked to a European official who just said flatly no at that point. And we did see through talking to officials that, again, these little blips, fumbling over a leader's name or your own cabinet secretary's name, or stumbling over the wording of the correct amount of Ukraine funding, that is catching people by alarm.
Well, here's an obvious question. You seem to have talked to a whole lot of people. When did you talk to them? Was this all done? All this reporting, was it done after the debate? Did you have conversations with them before the debate when these things were happening? Like he's describing conversations he had with world leaders about Biden at the G7, apparently having trouble communicating with world leaders. In the written version of their story, they basically just phrase it as in interviews. Like many people his age, Mr. Biden, 81, has long experienced instances in which he mangled a sentence, forgot a name, or mixed up a few facts, even though he could be sharp and engaged most of the time. But in interviews, people in the room with him more recently said the lapses seem to be growing more frequent, more pronounced, and more worrisome. Well, I would love to know, when did these interviews happen? I'm not a conspiracy theorist. It's very possible that they did this reporting after the debate. But this is the New York Times. I have a very hard time believing they just suddenly talked to all these people now after the debate. They had no inklings or nobody contacting them. Washington is a leak fest. There's always officials, Republican, Democrat, contacting reporters. I have a very hard time believing some of this wasn't sitting on their desk collecting dust. If not, if I'm wrong and Brian Stelter is right and all of these people knew nothing, all of these journalists knew nothing, then Biden and his administration deserve the biggest cover-up award of the 21st century, other than the Flint water cover-up, which is the subject of my book coming out in August, because they pulled off a Houdini act of hiding a clearly malfunctioning president. It is clearly bullshit that none of these people knew about it, which tells you the media hid this from the public, which is a scandal.